"Are you sure you want to go through with this, son?" whispered Father Michael, his weathered hand resting gently on the shoulder of 8-year-old Samuel Achafer. The boy stood barefoot in the dust-choked courtyard of the village square, clutching a single olive branch he'd found growing behind the ruins of what used to be his family's home. Around them, hundreds of faces formed a circle, some filled with guilt, others with defiance, and many with the kind of shame that comes from knowing you've done something you can never undo. Samuel nodded, his small frame somehow radiating a calm that made grown men shift uncomfortably. 6 months earlier, this same crowd had stood by in silence as the village council, led by the wealthy landowner Marcus Thorne, had evicted Samuel's family for being troublemakers after his father dared to speak against illegal land seizures. The eviction turned violent. Samuel's parents didn't survive the night. What nobody understood, what made this moment feel like the world had stopped spinning, was why this orphan child, who had every right to hate these people, had requested this public gathering. The magistrates expected accusations. Thorne's lawyers prepared for a dramatic testimony that would expose their crimes. The village braced for the reckoning they deserved. But Samuel hadn't come to destroy them. He'd come to offer them something far more difficult to accept: forgiveness. And what he was about to do would prove that sometimes the smallest voice carries the power to move an entire nation to its knees. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 10,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these stories matter, and tell me where you are watching from in the comments section. Please subscribe to Beyond Hope and Belief, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. Samuel's small fingers traced the smooth bark of the olive branch as he stood in the center of the square, surrounded by a sea of faces that refused to meet his eyes. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 3 times, each chime echoing like a judgment that hadn't yet been pronounced. "The boy's clearly been coached," muttered Marcus Thorne from his position near the magistrate's platform, adjusting the gold watch chain across his expensive waistcoat. "Probably that meddling priest put him up to this spectacle. Children don't understand legal matters." But Father Michael had done nothing except try to dissuade Samuel from this very moment. For 6 months, the priest had watched this child grieve in a way that defied explanation, not with the screaming rage of the wounded, but with a terrible, quiet understanding that made even the most hardened villagers uncomfortable when they passed him in the street. Samuel took 3 steps forward, and the crowd instinctively shifted back, as if proximity to innocence might burn. He stopped directly in front of Thorne, tilting his head up to meet the man's gaze. The landowner towered over him, a monument to wealth and power built on generations of taking what others had planted. "Mr. Thorne," Samuel said, his voice carrying with unexpected clarity across the silent square, "I brought you something." Thorne's eyebrows raised in theatrical surprise. "Did you now? And what could a little orphan possibly have that I would want?" The cruelty in his tone drew nervous laughter from a few of his associates, but it died quickly when nobody else joined in. Samuel extended the olive branch, holding it out with both hands like an offering at an altar. "My father used to say that anger is like a stone in your pocket. The longer you carry it, the heavier it gets, until one day you realize you've been walking bent over for so long you've forgotten how to stand up straight." The magistrate leaned forward on his bench, suddenly interested. This wasn't the testimony they'd expected. This wasn't a child demanding justice or weeping for his parents. This was something else entirely, something that made the air feel thick with possibility. "I've been carrying stones for 6 months, Samuel continued, his eyes never leaving Thorne's face. "And I'm tired of being bent over, so I came here today to give them back to the people they belong to." He paused, and in that pause the entire village held its breath. "Starting with you, sir, because I think you've been carrying stones much longer." 6 months earlier, the village of Ashford Grove had been exactly like 1,000 other rural communities scattered across the countryside. A place where everyone knew everyone's business, where Sunday church was more social obligation than spiritual practice, and where the division between those who owned land and those who worked it was as natural and unquestioned as the change of seasons. Marcus Thorne's family had owned the majority of the farmland for 4 generations. His great-grandfather had purchased it during a depression when desperate families sold their inheritance for pennies, and the Thornes had built an empire on that foundation of other people's desperation. To Marcus, this wasn't exploitation. It was simply the way the world worked. Some people were born to lead, to own, to command. Others were born to follow. Samuel's father, David Ackefer, had been a tenant farmer who worked 20 acres of Thorne's land, growing wheat and vegetables that fed half the village. But David had made a fatal mistake. He had learned to read. Not just the Bible passages Father Michael shared on Sundays, but actual books about land rights, tenant laws, and the history of how wealthy families had consolidated power through carefully orchestrated legal maneuvers that looked legitimate on paper but were fundamentally unjust. At a village council meeting 3 months before the eviction, David had stood up during the public comment period and done something nobody had done in living memory. He had challenged Marcus Thorne directly, not with violence or even raised voices, but with questions. Uncomfortable questions about why tenant farmers paid 70% of their harvest to landowners when the traditional rate had been 50%. Questions about why the village council, supposedly representing all residents, consisted entirely of landowners and their relatives. Questions about a recent land survey that had mysteriously redefined property boundaries in ways that always favored the Thornes. "Are you calling me a thief, David?" Thorne had asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm calling the system unjust, Marcus," David had replied, using the landowner's first name with a familiarity that made everyone in the room wince. "And I'm asking that we examine it together, as neighbors." But neighbors don't examine systems that benefit them. They defend them, and Marcus Thorne was very good at defense. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by Thorne's lawyer with the kind of professional courtesy that makes cruelty seem civilized. The document cited 17 different violations of the tenancy agreement, from improper maintenance of irrigation channels, to unauthorized modifications to farm structures, to conduct unbecoming of a tenant farmer. Each charge was technically accurate in the way that truth can be weaponized. David had indeed repaired a broken fence without written permission, had modified the irrigation system to be more efficient without formal approval, and had certainly engaged in conduct that Thorne found unbecoming. The notice gave the Ackefer family 72 hours to vacate the property. Samuel remembered his mother's face when she read the document, how her hands had trembled as she passed it to his father. He remembered the way his 2 older sisters had immediately started crying, not because they fully understood what was happening, but because children sense doom the way animals sense earthquakes. Something fundamental has shifted beneath the surface of the world. "We'll appeal," David had said, his voice steady despite the devastation in his eyes. "Father Michael knows a lawyer in the city. We have rights. Even tenants have rights. But rights are only as strong as the people willing to enforce them. And in Ashford Grove, all the people with power were standing firmly behind Marcus Thorne." The village watched in silence as the Ackefer family packed their belongings into a borrowed cart. Some neighbors looked away, unable to meet David's eyes. Others whispered among themselves, already rewriting history to make the eviction seem justified, inevitable, perhaps even merciful. "He brought this on himself," they said. "You can't challenge men like Thorne and expect to stay. He should have known better. He should have kept his head down." On the 3rd day, when the family hadn't finished packing, Thorne sent his men to expedite the process. The official report would later state that David Ackaffer had resisted lawful eviction and that reasonable force had been applied. But Samuel, hiding in the barn loft with his sisters, had seen everything. He had seen his father raise his hands in surrender. He had seen the first blow that dropped him to his knees. He had seen his mother run to help and the casual violence that followed. Father Michael found Samuel 3 hours after the incident, curled beneath the old oak tree at the edge of what used to be his family's property. The boy wasn't crying. That was what scared the priest most, the absolute stillness in those 8-year-old eyes, as if something fundamental had been extinguished or perhaps transformed into something else entirely. "Your sisters are at the church," Father Michael said softly, lowering himself to sit beside the child. "Mrs. Henderson is looking after them. They're asking for you." Samuel didn't respond, just kept staring at the farmhouse in the distance where his parents' bodies still lay. The magistrate had been called, of course, and the doctor, and all the official people who arrive after tragedy to document and classify and ultimately justify what has already happened. "Samuel, I need you to listen to me very carefully," the priest continued, his voice carrying an urgency that finally made the boy turn. "What happened to your parents was evil. There's no other word for it. Evil dressed up in legal documents and property rights and all the ways powerful people convince themselves that cruelty is just business. But you need to understand something crucial. The men who did this are watching you right now. They're watching to see what you'll do with your grief." "What do you mean?" Samuel's voice was barely a whisper. "I mean that if you respond with rage, with violence, with the kind of justice that feels right in your bones right now, they'll use it as proof that your father was dangerous, that your family deserved what happened. They'll make you into the villain of this story because that's easier than admitting they're the villains. Do you understand?" Samuel nodded slowly, and Father Michael saw something shift behind the boy's eyes, not resignation, but calculation. This child was thinking in ways that no 8-year-old should have to think. Over the following weeks, Samuel's grief took a form that confused everyone who witnessed it. He didn't rage against Thorne or demand justice from the magistrate. Instead, he began asking questions. Quiet, thoughtful questions that made adults profoundly uncomfortable. He asked the shopkeeper why he still sold goods to Thorne after what happened. He asked the village council members why they hadn't investigated the eviction. He asked the farmers why they attended church with a man who had blood on his hands. The village tried to forget. That's what communities do when confronted with collective guilt. They reconstruct reality until the uncomfortable parts fade into something manageable, something that doesn't require action or change. The official inquest ruled the deaths accidental and closed the case within a week. Marcus Thorne made a public statement expressing deep regret for the tragic accident and donated a modest sum to the church's orphan fund, a gesture that allowed people to believe he had a conscience after all. But Samuel wouldn't let them forget, not through dramatic confrontations or angry accusations, but through simple, persistent presence. He attended every church service, sitting in the front row where everyone had to see him. He stood outside the village council meetings, not disrupting them, just standing there with a quiet dignity that made the council members rush past with averted eyes. He helped Mrs. Henderson tend her garden, and when neighbors came to buy vegetables, they found themselves making small talk with the orphan boy whose existence was a living reminder of their silence. "That child is going to drive this village mad," muttered Thomas Blackwood, one of Thorne's closest associates, after nearly tripping over Samuel outside the general store for the 3rd time that week. "Someone needs to send him away, put him in an orphanage in the city where he belongs." But Father Michael refused every attempt to relocate Samuel, and the priest carried enough moral authority in the community that even Thorne couldn't override him directly. So the boy remained, a ghost haunting the conscience of Ashford Grove. It was Samuel's sister Elizabeth who first noticed the change. At 12 years old, she had taken on the role of mother to her younger siblings, and she watched Samuel with the protective anxiety of someone who'd already lost too much. "You're planning something," she said one evening as they prepared for bed in the cramped room behind the church that Father Michael had converted into living quarters. Samuel looked up from the olive branch he'd been carving with a small knife the priest had given him. "I'm not planning revenge, if that's what you're worried about." "Then what?" "I'm planning forgiveness," he said, and the way he said it made Elizabeth's skin prickle with something between hope and fear, but not the kind they expect. 3 days before the public gathering, Samuel did something that sent shockwaves through the village's carefully maintained peace. He delivered personal invitations, handwritten on pieces of birch bark, since he couldn't afford proper paper, to every member of the village council, every landowner, every person who had been present during his family's eviction, and Marcus Thorne himself. The invitation was simple. "I, Samuel Ackafer, request your presence in the village square this Saturday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I have something important to say to each of you. Please come." "It's a trap," Thorne said immediately when his lawyer delivered the bark invitation to his study. "The boy's going to make some kind of scene, probably try to shame me publicly. Well, two can play that game. I'll attend, but I'm bringing witnesses and legal representation. If he tries to accuse me of anything, I'll sue him for slander. Child or not, there are limits." But other recipients of the invitation reacted differently. Robert Chen, who had served on the council for 15 years, sat at his kitchen table staring at the piece of bark for 20 minutes, his wife watching him with growing concern. "Are you going to go?" she finally asked. "How can I not?" he replied. "That boy has been walking around this village for 6 months like a living question mark, and I think we all know what the question is. Maybe it's time someone finally answered it." Father Michael, who had not been consulted about the gathering, confronted Samuel in the church garden. "Do you understand what you're doing? These people are powerful, Samuel. They've already proven what they're capable of when threatened." "I'm not threatening them, Father," Samuel said, carefully pruning a rose bush with attention far beyond his years. "I'm offering them something they desperately need but don't know how to ask for." "And what's that?" "A way out of the prison they've built for themselves." The priest studied the boy's face, searching for signs of trauma or delusion or the kind of religious fanaticism that sometimes emerges from grief. But all he saw was clarity, unsettling, profound clarity. "You sound like you're planning to die for them," Father Michael said quietly. "No," Samuel replied, finally meeting the priest's eyes. "I'm planning to help them learn how to live again." Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect weather that makes tragedy seem impossible. Clear sky, gentle breeze, the smell of honeysuckle drifting across the village square. By 2:30, the square was already filling with people, far more than the dozen or so who'd been formally invited. News of the gathering had spread the way significant events always do in small communities, and now half the village was present, some genuinely curious, others drawn by the possibility of drama. Marcus Thorne arrived at precisely 3 o'clock, flanked by his lawyer and 2 of his farm supervisors, men whose size and demeanor suggested they were there for more than moral support. He positioned himself prominently near the magistrate's platform, a statement of power and territorial claim. The village council members clustered together nervously, unsure whether they were attending as officials or as accused parties. Robert Chen stood slightly apart from them, his face drawn with the kind of exhaustion that comes from 6 months of poor sleep. And then there was everyone else, farmers who had worked alongside David Ackafer, shopkeepers who had sold him goods, neighbors who had shared meals with the family, and dozens of people who had simply stood by and watched as the Acafors were destroyed. They formed a circle around the square's center, and the formation felt less like an audience and more like participants in some ancient ritual they didn't quite understand. At exactly 3 o'clock, Samuel walked into the center of the square, holding his olive branch. Father Michael walked slightly behind him, not as escort but as witness. The crowd fell silent with a speed that felt supernatural, as if the boy carried his own atmosphere of gravity that demanded attention. "Thank you for coming," Samuel said, his voice small but somehow reaching every corner of the square. "I know some of you are here because you're curious, some because you feel guilty, and some because you're angry that I asked you to come. All of those reasons are okay." Thorn snorted audibly. "Get on with it, boy. Some of us have actual responsibilities." Samuel turned to face him fully, and something about that direct gaze made the wealthy landowner shift his weight uncomfortably. "Mr. Thorn, I want to start with you because you're the most important person here. Not because you're the richest or the most powerful, but because you're carrying the heaviest. I don't know what kind of metaphorical nonsense that priest has been filling your head with," Thorn said, his voice sharp with defensive anger. "But I'm not here to listen to a child's sermon. If you have legal accusations to make them. Otherwise, stop wasting everyone's time." Samuel didn't flinch. "You're right that Father Michael taught me a lot these past 6 months, but he didn't teach me about stones. My father did. He used to collect them from the fields, smooth river stones that had been buried in the soil for hundreds of years. He'd hold them up to the light and say, 'Samuel, these stones are older than our family, older than this farm, older than the memory of anyone alive. They've been here through droughts and floods, through wars and peace. And you know what? They're still just stones. They can't grow anything. They can't feed anyone. All they can do is weigh down the soil.'" The crowd was leaning in now, drawn by the strange poetry of a child speaking like an ancient prophet. Even Thorn had stopped interrupting, though his face was flushed with something between rage and confusion. "For 6 months, I've been trying to figure out what to do with all this anger," Samuel continued, his voice steady. "Every morning I wake up and remember that my parents are dead because you wanted them off land that you own but they loved. And the anger comes back, heavy as a stone. Some days it's all I can carry. Some days it's so heavy I can't move at all." He walked closer to Thorn, close enough that the landowner could have reached out and touched him, though everyone present could see the man's hands were clenched into fists at his sides, as if he was physically preventing himself from either embracing or striking the child before him. "But then I realized something," Samuel said softly. "You're carrying stones too, much heavier ones than mine. I've been watching you these past 6 months, Mr. Thorn. I've seen the way you don't sleep. You're at your study window at 3 in the morning. I've seen the way you drink more than you used to. I've seen the way you avoid this square, the way you take the long route home so you don't have to pass the place where my parents died. You're carrying the weight of what you did and it's crushing you." "I did nothing illegal," Thorn said, but his voice had lost its edge. "Everything was documented, proper, legal." "I know," Samuel replied. "That's what makes it so heavy." The silence that followed Samuel's words was profound, the kind of silence that happens when a truth too large to ignore has been spoken aloud. Father Michael, watching from the edge of the square, found himself holding his breath, aware that he was witnessing something that would be told and retold for generations, assuming Samuel survived the next few minutes. "This is absurd," Thorn said, but the words came out weak, unconvincing. "I came here as a courtesy, not to be psychoanalyzed by a child." "You came here because you needed to," Samuel said simply. "Just like everyone else here needed to come, because we're all carrying stones we don't know how to put down." He turned slowly, addressing the entire circle of villagers. "My father taught me that anger is a stone in your pocket, but he also taught me something else, that forgiveness is the only thing strong enough to let you set it down without feeling like you're giving up, like you're saying what happened was okay." He held up the olive branch again, and in the golden afternoon light it seemed to glow with its own luminescence. "I found this branch growing behind what used to be our house. It shouldn't be there. Olive trees don't grow in this region and nobody planted it. But there it was, growing in the ruins. And I thought, maybe that's what forgiveness looks like. Not something we deserve or earn, but something that grows in impossible places." Samuel walked to Marcus Thorn and extended the branch again. This time the landowner didn't laugh or dismiss it. His hand trembled as he reached out, stopping inches from the offered gift. "I can't take that," he whispered. "I don't deserve forgiveness. What I did, what we all did, there's no absolution for that." "You're right," Samuel said, and the agreement seemed to surprise everyone. "You don't deserve it. None of us deserve forgiveness when we truly hurt someone. But that's the whole point. Forgiveness isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to stop letting the past control the future. It's about putting down stones that are crushing both of us." Thorne's eyes were wet now, and several people in the crowd were openly weeping. Robert Chen had his face in his hands. Mrs. Henderson was clutching her husband's arm so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "I forgive you," Samuel said quietly, just for Thorne, but in the profound silence everyone heard it. "Not because what you did was acceptable, but because I don't want to spend the rest of my life being defined by the worst thing you ever did. I don't want to be the boy whose parents were murdered. I want to be Samuel, who loved his parents and misses them every day, and who's trying to figure out how to build something good from something terrible." Marcus Thorne took the olive branch with shaking hands, and then, to the shock of every person present, the wealthy landowner, the man who had never bowed to anyone, sank to his knees in the dust before an 8-year-old orphan and wept like a man being torn apart and rebuilt simultaneously. The dam broke. One by one, other villagers stepped forward, some falling to their knees, others simply standing with tears streaming down their faces as 6 months of collective guilt and shame and carefully maintained denial came crashing down around them. Samuel stood in the center of it all, small and barefoot and impossibly strong, as the village of Ashford Grove finally learned that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is not violence or wealth or political power, but the simple, devastating courage to forgive when every instinct screams for revenge. Father Michael would later tell anyone who asked that he had never witnessed anything so holy in 40 years of ministry, not in cathedrals or during elaborate ceremonies, but there in a dusty village square where a child who had every right to hate instead offered grace, and in doing so, moved an entire nation to tears. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please do well to like, share, comment, and most especially subscribe. And turn on your notification for my next upload.